Good evening, everybody. It is Monday, June 18th. Yeah, June 18th, 2018. Gold Ghosts and Guns Hour here on YouTube and Periscope. You all had a great weekend. Hope you all who are fathers had a wonderful Father's Day. It is that time. We're going to talk about, I'm going to make NetDrag happy tonight. We're going to talk about geopolitics. We're going to talk about the world. Groups, how are you? All right, now that I've got all that going, thank you Thank you, by the way, TX, for the stuff about Germany. It gave me a real great jump start to my day, to be honest with you. It was really well done. So I appreciate that. Thank you. So we've got a hot time brewing in Germany over Angela Merkel's the challenge to Angela Merkel over her immigration policy emanating from her supposed sister party, the CSU. Yeah, Florida's pretty hot. I've been going outside on purpose at the hottest part of the day to mow grass for about half an hour in order to some people pay a whole lot of money for hot box yoga. I live in Florida. All I got to do is walk outside. So, I don't see the point of paying, $50 an hour to work out and to do yoga in a room without air conditioning when, I could just walk out in my front yard, or, most people in Florida can just walk out into their garage. Yeah, it was pretty hot. It was pretty hot this afternoon. I got the parking area outside my yard done, and then after that I did most of the backyard, and then had to rescue the lawnmower from all the hay strings that get wrapped around the spindle. And then once I was done with that, I'm like, I ain't finishing the yard. I'll do it tomorrow. Really? I'm still getting rain every day. So, it didn't rain this. Yeah, it did rain this afternoon. I'm literally getting rain every day at around 3 o'clock. So, while it's warm, it's really, really hot around 1 o'clock. What should be the hottest part of the day is getting rain. So, we're back into that summer. I don't know about up here, but where you are. I know you're farther south than I am, but up here in the larger in the northern part of the state, I'm getting rain right at when it's supposed to be the hottest part of the day, which is actually helping to cool everything off and make the evenings almost pleasant. It's not like it's taking until 3 o'clock in the morning to get under 80 degrees like it usually does. And then it gets down to 78 right around 6 a.m. and then the sun comes up and then it starts baking us. It's usually the way it works. So, but yeah, let's talk about Germany. Let's talk about all the other horrible stuff that's going on in the world. I think it's pretty awesome, actually, to see what's happening at a fundamental level, because it's indicative of what happens when you screw with people's sense of community at a fundamental level. And this is a big fight. Okay, and I've got an article up on Strategic Culture Foundation right now where I go into it. I know we talked about this a little bit on Friday, but I'm going to talk about it in more depth here. The reason immigration is so important, the reason why it's so divisive, the reason why why people react so strongly to it and why it becomes such a divisive political issue is because it really does fundamentally hit us at our kind of fight or flight response. It's part of our in-group, out-group bias. It's part of the way we're hardwired to reject people who are not like us inherently. It doesn't matter who we are. And one of the problems with all forms of collectivism, and defining a country is a form of collectivism, saying defining a group of people over a geographical border as a country is a form of collectivism. It forces people to ultimately have to think in terms of that identity. And most people consider themselves like Germans or Italians or Americans or Chinese or whatever, and they identify themselves with their nationality first and not their locality first. I don't run around saying I'm Floridian more than I say I'm an American. I don't necessarily say that I'm, one of those dirty North Florida rednecks, say I'm a Floridian, right? And that form of and that creates a baseline of collectivist thinking, and it generates then by defining it as that then defines the limits of what we're talking about in terms of our community, and in this case, the community is the country, and therefore we should be talking about national immigration levels, even immigration policy, even though people who are immigrating to the United States in Oregon or Washington have no effect really on people in Florida other than through transfer payments and government transfer and all of that. So the minute we stop defining our community as something as large as the United States, quote unquote illegal immigration into Texas doesn't matter to Floridians or South Carolinians or anybody else if they weren't part of the same country. So this is one of the fundamental problems with having countries as big as ours. That's the first thing. So then we take that same argument and move it over to Europe, where now you've got 27 supposed countries all being forced to act under the auspice of the EU. And there's a one-size-fits-all policy created by one person for a specific agenda. And she is now in serious hot water politically. Because ultimately, people don't want to be told who is and who is not a member of their community. That is for them to decide. Right? I live out in the middle of nowhere, and I'm not itching to subdivide my property so I can sell it to a whole bunch of neighbors. One of the reasons why I didn't speak to my mom for the last 5 years of my life was because she sold the house that she was supposed to give to me in her will to some random woman and put her on the corner of my house. It was really horrible. And it was terrible. That's how strongly I feel about it. I want to control my environment. I want to have, and I know that I can't control anything more than my immediate environment because, well, I'm a rational person. I'm a libertarian. Throw that out there. So the reason why this the fundamental issue here is that people are inherently discriminatory. They are inherently, hate to say it, people, but we're all inherently racist to a certain level, and we should be. We should be discriminatory. We should be racist at a certain level, not hatefully racist, but in that we're going to immediately and always reject the other, someone we don't know, and have our guard up at all times because that's the way we're wired. And the farther the stranger they look to us than what we are and what we're used to, the more naturally reticent we're going to be. Potentially hostile. We should rather be reticent than hostile, but hey, you are who you are. Okay? I'm not placing a value judgment on it. I'm just saying this is the natural reaction that people are going to have. Okay? So, and that the problem that the left and the cultural Marxists have painted themselves into a corner on is this very thing, and trying to tell people and guilt people for feeling bad about being human. And it's insane. But it's done as a mechanism of control to get people to second guess and doubt everything that their body is telling them to be. So ultimately, when you try to create forced immigration, and in this case of Germany, in the case of the EU, it's about forced immigration and then no assimilation. And then immediately trying to somehow assimilate 1 million people into Germany. 1 out of 83 people into Germany who have no frame of reference on how to be German. It's unfair to expect people to take that burden on. It's on both sides. Because ultimately, it's not that people aren't willing to be welcoming. It's that they want to be welcoming, and they deserve to be welcoming, and they should be welcoming because it's their life and it's their property and it's their hard-earned community at stake. So they should have the final say-so as to whether or not they want to have these new people enter their community or not. It only makes sense. It just makes sense. And the real big point is that a climatization to a new culturalization takes time. I mean, I talked about this in a recent editorial in the Gold Goats and Guns newsletter, talking about this very issue, that talking about capitalism, the fundamental problem of that you always have to overcome in any voluntary transaction. At some point, anybody popping in here for the first time is going to see me ranting about this stuff and possibly getting a really bad first impression, and then immediately walking out of the room because I'm not talking about stuff that because they take things out of context or they see the way I look or whatever, and their immediate reaction is whatever it is, and then they may leave. Some may stay, some may leave. And in commerce, you have to overcome that natural reticence and that natural distrust that somebody's trying to get one over on you, right? I lived this for 5 years every Saturday morning at the farmer's market, trying to sell raw goat dairy out of the back of my car to people. I'm thinking, the milk is good, the products are great, I all this really cool stuff. Why don't you buy it? And they're all just judging me as to whether I'm full of shit or not. They're sizing me up as to whether or not I'm authentic, whether or not I'm going to sell them rotten food, especially at the prices that I was charging for. But I had to charge the prices I was charging for it. Otherwise, it wasn't worth my time to show up. And so this is the barrier. This is the natural emotional barrier to commerce. Now multiply that by 83 million people, put it in Germany, and then wonder why Angela Merkel's in trouble politically today. They're out of their minds. So I know we talked previously about possibilities are here. And it's very obvious that. So what happened this morning, let's talk about what happened this morning. Not get too far afield here. What happened this morning is that Horst Seehofer, the head of the CSU and the current interior minister, gave Merkel a 2-week ultimatum. I don't know if it was an ultimatum. It was kind of, he might have, he could have cucked out, right? I'm not ready to pass judgment on that yet. So it's, kind of a piecemeal. What he's arguing for is, or he gave Merkel the last offer he gave to Merkel was she gets 2 weeks to put together a package, and he's willing to, do a staged rollout of his new master plan for Germany's immigration reform. I didn't look at the details of the plan. I don't know one way or the other. But I think the point here, and there's a couple of important points to think about. The Germans are not the Italians. The Italians change governments like most people change their shirts. About every 18 months to 2 years, the Italians have another government. They've had like 60-something governments since the end of World War II. I mean, it's insane. The Italians don't care. They don't have a very tenuous relationship with their government. So them going and voting for the radical party to make some radical change isn't really out of character for the Italians. Is, though, for the Germans. The Germans are much more conservative this way, and they really don't like political turmoil. They were having a real hard time with Merkel taking 6 months to put a coalition together. They didn't want to go back to the polls and vote again. They're like, well, we already voted. Come up with you. It's your job to figure it out and put a government together. And that's fair. That's just the way they are. And they're not used to this kind of fractious political landscape. User 13 says Germans seem allergic to change. I'm going to put those words in her mouth, not mine. But whatever it is, I mean, I was talking about the same thing to my friend of mine this afternoon. He said, yeah, they don't like political turmoil because they're Germans. Like, well, that's fine. I mean, I put it however you want. I'm going to put it, a little bit more politically than that. And say, look, and it's just that's the way they are, and fair enough. There's no value judgment here. It is what it is. And from that perspective, it makes sense that why Seehofer would go this route. That he would bring the issue up, challenge Merkel, but then not necessarily go nuclear immediately, because going nuclear will not be popular politically when there should be an opportunity to come to a compromise. And ultimately, what he's done is he's put the ball back in Merkel's court to compromise. And if she doesn't come up with a better agreement, she doesn't compromise at all, then she's going to she's going to tie her own noose and hang herself. And so that's effectively what he's done here. Right. They don't like disorder. The Germans do like orderly things that train. That's the way they are. They're not good with, oh yeah, we'll get it done tomorrow. That's not the way they are. Fine. It is who they are. If that's their cultural identity and that's what's been bred and that's who they are, then that's great. And so it makes sense to go slowly here if you're going to get rid of the chancellor who's been in power since 2006, 2005. Woman's been in power forever. They've had continuity at the top for a long, long time. And I think it really needs to be, if there's going to be a change at the top in Germany, it can't be a kind of behind the back knife stabbing, Julius Caesar kind of thing. It's going to have to be that the people eventually say, okay, that's enough. We're done now. They've got to come to the conclusion about this, relatively slowly and on their own time. And that brings me to the real point. I'm not really interested per se in whether or not Seehofer survives this. I know he is, and I know he's worried about the CSU losing its majority in Bavaria. What I'm interested in is what happens once Merkel's gone. Because right now, if you look at the polls, and I'm gonna pop open my latest article, show you a tweet from this morning, from Alice Weidel, the head of AFD, with the current big desktop. Bring that in. Okay, can you guys see this? Well, that's way too. All right, what we're looking at. So you guys can see that, right? Okay. CSU CDU has 30%. That's down 4 points from 2 weeks ago. The SPD is now down to 16%. They were at 20% at the election. AFD is up to 15%. FDP is holding at 10. Der Linke is holding at 9. The Greens are up to 9, or up to 14%, and they're up a couple of points. Important to note here that in any re-election, you can expect the CSU CDU to lose, to probably only poll about 25%, right? Simply because they are the failed government. Where does the 5% go? Does the SPD lose another couple of points? Where's those other 8 points going to come from? What's it going to look like? What's it going to look like is going to have 5 parties between 15 and 18% 18 and 25% of the vote. It's going to look like Spain. And in my mind, that's a recipe for disaster. So the article that I wrote this morning, or really this afternoon, because it took me a couple of hours to put that whole thing together, is looking specifically at AFD. They are in a very interesting position. So when you look at the league, you look at the Northern League in Italy, and if you go back and look at, actually I used 2 case studies. First, you've got UKIP, moves up to about 12% of the vote in conjunction with Brexit. UK parliamentary election rules are so Byzantine that even with 12% of the vote, they were never, or 12% popular support, they were never in any danger of winning a seat in Parliament. Maybe one, right? Mostly because of the way I don't understand. I don't even pretend to understand how the UK election system works, and I don't want to. I just know that UKIP was never going to get a significant number of parliamentary seats in the 2015 elections. And the fact that they didn't was telling you that when it came to the Brexit vote, that 12% that they had was really just a bunch of disaffected Tories. At the minute UKIP, it was done. It's almost like the Libertarian Party here. When people are really angry with the Republicans, the LP goes from 3% to 5% or 6% or 7%. All of a sudden, there's a big protest vote. But it's not like they've stopped being Republicans. User 13 actually asks, in such a scenario, would Germany break up? Example, Bavaria says, forget the hell the hell with you guys, and we're just gonna be Bavaria. I don't think so. Honestly, I don't think so. So, to be honest. So back to UKIP. UKIP got to around 12%. Brexit happened. Nigel Farage quits, and this group never rebrands itself into something else, and it collapses, and all the Tories go back to the Tories, right? So all these protest Tories, all these newly minted libertarians go back to being Republicans again. It's the same thing. In Italy, we had an actual successful rebranding and creation of a new powerful party. The first was Five Star. They just rode dissatisfaction all the way up to 25%, 28%, 30%. But the League, formerly the secessionist Northern League, which was only really interested in, hey, we just want to be separate from the rest of you deadbeats in the rest of Italy. We just want to be us, and we want to leave. And they had around 10% every year. They would poll around 10%. When they came off their secessionist mountain, formed a coalition with Forza Italian, Silvio Berlusconi, saying, look, we are now the League. We represent all of Italy, and we want to reform all of Italy. That was a very powerful message. You can thank Salvini for that. That was really smart. And they went from 10% at the beginning of the year to 17% at the election. I'll get to that question in just a minute. To 17% at the election. And then since the election, they've done everything to solidify that from a protest movement into a real political movement. And now the League has moved up to 28%. Now remember, we're talking about the whole early adopter, early majority, silent majority, that curve. I think it's the Rogers curve, right? Which Malcolm Gladwell talked about as well. And tipping point. And yes, Green Penguin, I do think that part of Seehofer's plan is to try and take the win is trying to stall AFD's rise. And this is what's important. So think about all the things we've talked about so far. Look at now what happened with the League. The League broke through the 16% barrier and immediately moved up to 30%. Go back to 2008, Ron Paul. Ron Paul was able to get up to around 12% easily. The first 10% is easy. The next 6% are actually really hard. And then once you get through that 16% barrier, you now have a real political movement. And I'm convinced that Ron Paul at 21%, constantly polling around 21, 22% in all these states that he wound up coming second to Romney in and lost, was all bullshit. He was actually at 30%, and they just gave a whole crop of his votes to Romney and took Romney's votes and gave them to Ron Paul, and then massaged the numbers so that Romney got 25% and won all these states he didn't deserve. Paul got 21%. And the rest is history. Okay, and I'm convinced of this. I've seen statistical regressions of these numbers from the Daily Paul back in 2012. I can't find links to that shit anymore. I wish I had actually kept those articles, but to show what I'm talking about. But it's absolutely true what happened. So take that one step further, like the superdelegates. It was a similar kind of thing. Now, take this, now go and look at AFD. AFD is polling between 15 and 16% depending on what poll you look at, right? They're at that point. They're at that tipping point. They didn't even treat him like crap at the 2012 convention. He didn't even go. He had to have his own shadow convention, which Laura Ingraham, by the way, spoke at. Big props to Laura Ingraham. She's the real deal. Speaking of UKIP, what are my thoughts about Paul Joseph Watson et al. Joining UKIP? I think it's great. I don't think it's going to do any good. I think I don't think it's going to do any good until the Tories completely betray Brexit and they have to do this shit all over again 5 years from now. And there's a real revolt within the UK. But I don't see any. If they betray Brexit here, UK politics is going to be really uninteresting until about 2022 or so. As UKIP has to rebuild its support. So AFD is now at that moment. And understand that once you get up to that 16% level, if you don't do something interesting, if you don't do something like Salvini did with the League and rebrand and change your message, become something different, you're never going to break through. You're just a protest vote. Protest votes do not win elections. Protest votes do not change the course of a country's political vector. UKIP did die once Farage left. Farage was wrong to leave at that moment in time. What he should have done was to say, now that we've gotten Brexit, now you need to vote UKIP to ensure that Parliament doesn't betray Brexit. We are going to, if you vote for us, we will be the people who deliver you what you just voted for. You cannot trust the Tories. Didn't do that. See Ross Perot. Perot did the same thing. And Perot broke through the 16% barrier. Remember, he got 20% in that election with Bill Clinton and George Bush the Elder. So AFD is in a very interesting position here. They're considered the radicals. They're considered the nut jobs. Well, not the nut jobs. They're becoming more, except at 16%, they're no longer the nut jobs. Now they have to start talking about community. Now they got to start talking about where Germany goes next. But they have to do it within the context of not rocking the boat too much. That's the point. That's the trick. And if they do that, they can be the 30% party. Replace the CDU. No time flat. They can, because if not, if one of the major parties collapses, you could wind up with Germany going to the Greens. The Greens are getting close to that same 16% level. You could have a resurgence of the Social Democrats. These things are all possible. Once it gets this chaotic, and if you don't think for 1 second that Merkel's not aware of this, that Seehofer's not aware of this, that Steinmeier's not aware of this, that Sigmar Gabriel's not aware of this, that all of these major German politicians aren't aware of, then you're nuts. They do. And the point here is that AFD has to rebrand themselves very quickly. User 13 says, incentives to have Marxists leave and support them in place might be a good platform. Yes. The Greens are Marxist loonies. That does not mean that they cannot take power. The Marxist loonies were in charge here for freaking 30 years. Yes, the Greens are leaving because people are leaving the SPD. But what happens if the Greens rebrand themselves when they get to that level? If you're going to have a true shift, and it makes sense. Look, it makes sense for Germany, the naturally conservative Germans, want to protect their German identity and all of this stuff and their German work ethic and this and that and everything else. It makes sense for AFD to become that party. But they have to do it right, or the whole thing will... right? They're still running out. The Marxists are still running Congress and the legislature here in the United States. The long march through the institutions was not just academia. So that's what's going on here in Germany. And it hit me this morning while I was talking with TX on Twitter about what the situation is. We were just chatting back and forth, and I kept mentioning X, Y, and kind of the bare bones of this. I'm like, oh, shit. This is a great blog post. So thank you, love. Really appreciate that. And then it almost got away from me and kind of spiraled off into but I think it's right, and I think the argument is right. So if you haven't checked out that blog post, there's a link to it down below in the description of the video. The Long March was everything. The Long March through it all. So, all right. All right, I'm about to get the lowdown because FYI, TX's husband is German. So what I saw that she was sending me stuff on Twitter this morning saying, "Dude, Seehofer cucked out. Like my husband just translated an article for me, and this is what's gonna happen." I'm like, oh, okay, it's it's great. I actually have I've got an email response to write to somebody this evening when I get off of here, telling them that no, I don't speak German. So before I get on to Trump, Rusal, aluminum, and why the Russians dumped $48 billion worth of Treasury bonds, because I'm the only one talking about why it happened. The Germans as a whole are still very conscientious about nationalism, very conscious of their of moving towards nationalism. I know it's going to be a hard sell for AfD. They're going to have to be really careful. That's why I wanted to put that post out today and talk about it. They have to be very careful. Cynical Skeptic says it's tricky with Germany regarding its identity. They've been beaten down into the ground because of their Nazi past, and that any attempt of restoring identity is being perceived as fascism. I know. Similar to what TX was saying on Periscope. That's the real trick for AfD, and I don't know that the leadership are quite hip to that yet. They have to understand where they are. Random Researcher, do you think we will see resurgence of the Social Democrats, even though Sanders and his wife are under investigation? China is the backing to Sanders, and the financial rug has been pulled out of the DNC. I don't know, man. I don't think there's a resurgence of the burning wing of the Democratic Party. I think the Democratic Party becomes the burning wing of the Democrats after they get destroyed in 2018. I think they wind up being a minor party for a long time. I think the Republicans start running 60% majorities nationally. And the other 40% is like the Democrats, and you'll see the Greens push up the 5% or 5-7% range, and the Libertarians push up in the same levels. I have not looked into having my articles properly translated into Chinese, German, Russian, and Spanish. I know that there's a guy out there that translates them into Italian for me. He runs a blog that translates some of my work into Italian. Bernie is not a big identity politics guy, but he's also not really all that impressive either. Bernie Sanders is going to be in serious trouble going forward. He has no real base. I do think I agree with User 13. I think the GOPE, meaning the GOP establishment, needs to get its clock cleaned. Yes, I think that's coming. Children in cages, winning issue for the Democrats. I don't think there is a so Random Researcher on YouTube says, I don't think there is a grassroots resurgence, but I do think that that will be their default, i.e. move back towards the social democratic Bernie bro thing, because they lost their funding. But they have proven they can crowdfund candidates with good propaganda. Maybe. I think you've crowdfunded candidates with David Brock and George Soros' money, and I do think, believe it or not, I really do think that Soros is going to wind up penniless if he lives another 5 years. He's got to live another 5 years. And that may not be in the cards. He is 89. But then again, evil likes to live for a long, long freaking time. I really do think that Soros could spend so much money trying to fight all of these fires at the same time. $200 million here, $50 million there, $75 million there. I mean, by the time, when you start adding this stuff up, after a while, this is a lot of money. And if he ever gets caught, really caught, or gets hung out to dry, that we seize his assets and he's done. Bernie is a globalist shill. The less we see of him, the better. My bet is on Tulsi Gabbard. I would love to see Tulsi Gabbard take over the Democratic Party. I think it would be an honest... Oh, that Soros ends up penniless? Okay, Suzanne Johnson, since I'm literally like on a meat diet right now, it would have to be a meat cake. But I would take it. So, there you go. Bernie's politics do work better when unemployment is high. I would love to see Tulsi Gabbard take over the Democratic Party. I don't like her on economics, but at least she's an honest to God, honest liberal. Comes out of honestly. Yeah, I can. I understand that there was a lot of that crowdfunding going on, similar to Ron Paul. But remember, Bernie betrayed everybody. Selling out to Clinton, those guys are gone. They all voted for Trump. Tulsi Gabbard is too far left on certain issues. I'm not going to argue that. But her being fundamentally anti-war and anti-empire, that makes her light years ahead of almost every Democrat. And I think she makes a really good counterpoint to Donald Trump. Honestly, with the way Trump's foreign policy has evolved, I think the Democrats, I don't think they'll ever let her, but imagine Gabbard coming through the Democrats and then going up against Trump in 2020. Dude, that would be the best thing that could ever happen. She'd lose, but she would force Trump into an anti-war position. How much money does Soros really have? Apparently at least $18 billion because he gave it all to OSF. But then again, remember, he's giving it whatever money he's given them. Do you think that they're that well run? When this thing starts to go crazy and they've gotten that much money, all of a sudden it's like, are you talking about an organization that's capable of running and managing $18 billion worth of assets? If Hillary is still breathing air, she will be the nominee. No, she won't. I do think the Democrats are going to double down on all the identity politics. I think they will. I think they're absolutely going to do it. I think it's written in the cards. But I do think that there's a possibility of an insurgent run by Gabbard on an anti-empire, pro-military anti-empire stance. Very similar to Ron Paul. She has the opportunity. Being ex-military, she really has a lot of cred. So. Yeah, and large organizations are always easily infiltrated, which is why you want things to be as small as possible. So, I mean, 2020 is, well, I mean, we're halfway through 2018. I guess we have to start talking about positioning. She outright said she doesn't care about white votes. Well, she will if she's the nominee. Hillary does still control the DNC. That is true. She controls the purse strings. But Hillary is not going to run in 2020. Hillary can barely stand up, and she's running around. I don't think that's a back brace she's wearing. I think she's wearing a bulletproof vest. I think Hillary has hurt so many people and has cost them so much money. Oprah was never going to go anywhere. All right. I don't know that I really have a lot of. Yeah, I don't know. I think. Abrams for Georgia. Huh. Okay, I see. Got it. And Stacey Abrams is running on the what, screw Whitey vote? Huh. Oh, we'll see. I think that stuff plays nice to keep people on the farm. I don't think it wins elections. All right. Let's talk about, because when we were doing this on Friday night, the news had just come out from this month's TIC report for April. Remember, the TIC report is the Treasury International Capital Report, and it comes out 2 months in arrears. So we get the numbers for April in June, and then we'll get the new numbers for May and July. The way it is. And from the TIC report, we learned that the Russians dumped $48 billion. Now, if the Chinese dumped $48 billion, it's not that big a deal. $48 billion. They got 1.18 trillion. The Russians dumped half of their reserves. And they did it because of Rusal. If you remember back to April, Trump sanctioned Rusal and Oleg Deripaska, the majority shareholder. Now, he did it for a couple of reasons. And not really to harm the Russians. He did it because it was the beginning of his wanting to highlight what was wrong with the sanctions, with the tariff structure all over. It was the precursor to start the process of going after Germany and China and everybody else, and at the same time trying to pump prime a new domestic aluminum market. Unfortunately, like everything else, and this is where sometimes I really kind of wonder whether Donald Trump truly does have any clue as to how modern markets work. Because, okay, so you nearly bankrupted Rusal overnight. Yeah, their bonds dropped by 50%. Yeah, their stock dropped by 50%. And I'll explain why in a minute. But Glencore, Rio Tinto, some of the biggest metals traders in the world, and metals and aluminum smelters in the world, all of a sudden didn't have a friggin' supply chain. You cut the dollar out of the aluminum market today, and all of a sudden everything explodes because Rusal provides up to 15% of the entire aluminum market. And all of a sudden, everybody was like, how in the fuck am I going to build airframes? How am I going to build cars? How am I going to build, how am I going to, the aluminum foil? I mean, the whole supply chain goes tits up overnight. It's not that Rusal had a tremendous amount of debt denominated in dollars, that all of a sudden they wouldn't be able to get access to American banks to be able to roll over their debt, and then they'd have to pay them off. And no, there's like $1 billion worth of debt. It's nothing. It's their accounts receivable and the structure of the futures market and everything else, because this shit's hedged out 6 months, 9 months, a year out into the future. And it's all going to be, and you all of a sudden you can't just unwind those positions overnight. I mean, this is how the modern I saw all of that. Random. I'll get back to it in a minute. So what the Russians did, and I just went ahead and just did the forensic evidence. I knew what they did. I just had to prove it. What they did was they sold a whole bunch of treasury bonds because they want to be out of treasuries, raise the dollars necessary, and then swap those dollars to Rusal and to the Russian banks to be able to cover their short-term liabilities, their accounts receivable for all intents and purposes. And that went on for 6 weeks until the middle of May when the Treasury Department finally relaxed everything and said, okay, you guys got 6 months to stop doing business with this company. And that gives Rusal some time to change the ownership of the company. And then at that point, you know what will happen. If, Trump's still going to be in his bond, and he'll just turn around and, change the rules again and then force everybody to start all over again. I mean, it's just silly. The whole thing is just asinine because it's counterproductive in every freaking way. But what it does do, and what it has done, is politicize the aluminum market in a way that it never had before. And if you guys don't remember, I did it in a blog post about 3 or 4 weeks ago, talking about how China, because they own the London Metals Exchange, is now issuing, or was beginning the process to issue, yuan-denominated industrial metals futures contracts, not just gold, and not just, so they do gold now, and silver. And then the Shanghai Exchange does oil. But the London Metals Exchange is now looking to do industrial metals. Why? Why the fuck do you think? Because now they're going to provide an alternative to the market, and so that the global supply chain for aluminum is not held politically hostage by the President of the United States. Whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, whether you think it's right or wrong, whether you think we should subjugate the world or we shouldn't, I got news for you. The Chinese can issue, because they own the LME, they can issue futures contracts in whatever freaking currency they want. If they really wanted to screw with Trump, all they had to do is do a euro-denominated one. But they're doing a yuan-denominated one for a reason. So, and that reason is, honestly, because it's easier, because there's no way that Trump will sanction Chinese banks, because he sanctions Chinese banks that can't do business in the dollar, then the American economy crashes. When you owe the bank $1,000, it's your problem. When you owe the bank $1 trillion, it's the bank's problem. Well, when you do as much business between the United States and China as we do, there's no winner in a trade war. There's no winner in a sanctions war. Okay, because both get hurt. And both will then turn around and create alternatives and ways, effectively black markets, or essentially what is effectively black markets, they'll just shift away from it. Okay, well, I can't do business in dollars anymore. Fuck you. I'll do it in yuan. We'll do it in euros. We'll do it in washing machines or soybeans or some other goddamn thing. This is what India did to get around U.S. sanctions in 2012. They were trading washing machines and soybeans for freaking barrels of oil. Whatever. The U.S. State Department was out there crowing, going, they're selling junk for oil. So they need washing machines. They don't need you. They don't need dollars. Dumbass. Not that hard. So if the Russians do decide to pull the rest of their money out of the U.S., which I will not doubt in any way, but what that proves is, now look, the Russians could have done any number of things. They got $465 billion in foreign exchange reserves. They didn't have to drop their treasury bonds. They dropped their treasury bonds on purpose. They dropped their treasury bonds to spook the United States and say, look, you do this, and we start doing that. Now, the Russians at $50 billion over the course of a month couldn't do much other than push the 10-year note up about 30 basis points. But there's $6.3 trillion out there in U.S. Treasury debt owned by foreign central banks. we're looking at a humdinger of a US dollar bull wave that could be the biggest US dollar bull wave of all time. As everybody who's short dollars needs to go long dollars. That could get interesting quickly. Not that selling in would blunt the rise of the dollar, but it would also force rates up at a rate faster than the Fed can absorb them. And with the United States running a massive budget deficit right now, Trump, like Trump or don't like Trump, does not matter. The budget deficit that he's running right now is not conducive, is not strengthening this country. Not when we have that pile sitting out there, and the Russians just showed us what will happen when everybody has to dump. Otherwise, their countries collapse. And never forget that the Chinese are sitting back going, our job at this point is to make ourselves look more attractive. The Russians are doing the same thing, dollarizing their economy. They're going to de-dollarize. Over the course of this next year or so, Rusal will diversify their business out of the dollar and into the yuan and the euro and other things in order to do what? And not have to be worried about this. And the global supply chain will become diversified, and fewer dollars will flow through global trade. Remember that, regardless of what Martin Armstrong likes to talk about, global trade is the M0 of the world. It's the high-powered money of the world because it's the money that all the financialization is then spun up off of. You can't have, if global trade collapses, then the credit markets collapse fivefold. Just like M3 is 100 times bigger than M0, but a 2% change in M0 creates a 20% change in M3. You cut back on the adjusted monetary base by 1 or 2%, and the credit markets drop by 20%. Because they're all levered up based on that base money. Same thing. All these national currencies that have been issued at many multiples of the dollars they hold in their reserves, and the loans that are issued based on that at a 10x multiplication of that. What leverage giveth on the way up, it takes away on the way down twice as fast. It is a real tragedy that more people do not watch the scope because they would actually fucking learn something. Guys have to understand that's what's going on. This is the big problem. Trump is inviting this at a certain level, and look, I know why he's doing it. I know why he's doing some of it. I understand it. I can almost, even though I'm a free market, libertarian and Austrian economist, I can understand why he's doing it. What I can't understand is that there comes a point when it's going to fail, and when it fails, it's going to be ugly. Gary Cohn and John Shapiro developed the ice wall, which stores more than 1 million tons of aluminum in Detroit warehouse back in 2012, of which Obama forced him to sell a portion of it. We can and they've been doing a lot of this stuff. What Random Research is talking about is this is similar to the way they've created tremendous leverage Yeah. So what's the point? We're sitting on that much aluminum, then we don't care. Then we don't care whether the global supply chain gets destroyed because we'll still have what we have domestically. I don't know if it changes very much, but you can't have a contraction of the global aluminum market, and then you can't have a contraction of the global aluminum market and not expect it to not boomerang back on your financial markets. If you're sitting on that much aluminum in warehouses, it's still gonna boomerang back on you. Chinese are sitting on millions of tons of freaking copper that were used as collateralized, where they used to collateralize debt. It's been pushed on, it's been liquidated on the market, and then but copper's now in a structural shortage. The uranium market's been depressed for nearly 10 years while the Russians dismantle all their old nukes and sell all that material on the open market as single work units for nuclear reactors. Well, that's playing a very dangerous game. It's not going to make the world a better place. It's not enough to destroy the entire aluminum market. Maybe for 6 months. The Chinese will take up the market share. You'll see it happen. And the boomerang effect will be a massive slowdown in industrial production around the world. And guess what? If there's a massive slowdown in industrial production around the world, who the fuck are we going to sell the value-added products that we're going to use all that aluminum for to sell to somebody else? Export. What did Russia do? Oh, by selling $50 billion of Treasury bonds. Now I'm confused. I'm going to wait for a second until the next comment comes through. Oh, when they were not as dangerous as what Russia did when they were hit with their own sanctions. When they were hit with sanctions, they started making their own products. Yes, we saw that. We saw them turning inward. Right. Trump wanted to create and restart a domestic aluminum production market. There are easier ways to do it than this. The better way to go about it is to do what he should be doing, what he's got Scott Pruitt doing at the EPA, and what he did with his tax cuts and the corporate welfare and the corporate tax cuts and all of that, is to make building a aluminum smelter plant here in the United States cost efficient. Hard to do, right? That's the thing to do. If you want to jumpstart that economy, fine, go do so. But do it the right way. Don't do it through currency manipulation and forcing everybody else out of business. There's no need for that. Invite the world back. Don't invade it. I just don't get it. It's a global economy. I'm not really crazy about the idea of us. I don't see disrupting the world's political and economic structure simply to build a couple of aluminum smelters. I mean, if we need to support, I would rather Trump just give out $10 billion a year or $5 billion a year in corporate welfare to the aluminum and steel industry in this country just to keep them alive. I have read those guys. I have watched Steve King and Richard Warner. I have. I understand. Macroeconomics is not a thing. Macroeconomics doesn't exist. It's a bullshit argument. I'm an Austrian. There is no macroeconomics. Macroeconomics doesn't exist. It doesn't. I talk global macro all the time, but it doesn't exist. You have to remember that there is no macroeconomic anything. What there is are individual people making decisions based on their based on their rational assessment or even irrational assessment of their incentives, and then deploying capital productively. The United States has a labor value problem that comes from the massive amount of regulation and taxes that have been put on capital to make it impossible to be competitive. Our labor is more expensive because it's worth more, but it's not as expensive. But it's currently 3 times as expensive as it needs to be, or twice as expensive as it needs to be. And that was done on purpose, to raise the cost of doing business in the United States in order to push production into other countries, in order to allow the European Union to run a social welfare system that we pay for. Okay? Where a lot of this analysis falls down, in my estimation, is that it's so rife with national need, when the problem is fundamentally that governments spend too much frickin' money and debase their currencies, and then the marketplace, the domestic marketplace, has to make up the shortfall, and then the politicians complain when at the other countries or doing the same thing. Why? Yeah, it is when. Oh yeah, well, it is when the government issues debt-based frickin' currency. When the currency is a debt that the government has to issue. You run a trade deficit, you export dollars, and you bring goods back. The government doesn't have to run a budget deficit. Triffin's paradox is when you are the world's reserve currency, you have to run a budget deficit and a trade deficit at the same time. You can't possibly run a budget surplus and a trade deficit, and you can't do both. Triffin's paradox is very simple, that you have to, in order to be the world's reserve currency, in order to continue to export your currency to liquefy global trade, you have to run a budget deficit. That's Triffin's paradox. Only the United States has to deal with this. Juan Isaac is asking, will Shanghai take the precious metals market from London? In other words, will the Chinese now be able to set the price of gold? Well, since they own the LME and they own the Shanghai Exchange, the only one left is the COMEX. Chinese have been setting the price of gold for quite a while now. Everybody blames the COMEX and JP Morgan. I got news for you. The Chinese and the Russians love low price gold, allowing them to accumulate at stink bid prices. If no deficit, no reserve currency. If at the end of the day, if the United States stops running a deficit, then we have to pull back on the amount of dollars that liquefy the market. private sector will do whatever it has to do. The private sector will raise debt, sell equity, do whatever it has to do. It's not as simple as it. Governments screw up everything, and they have screwed up the way money flows across borders because we start thinking about money having to flow across borders because the government is involved in all the transactions. With no government setting the prices of the money, with no government actually doing any of this stuff, it's not even necessary. None of this is necessary. Companies buy and sell goods on the open market using whatever currencies they need to in order to liquefy their trade. We don't do that anymore. The money has always been the money when the government owns the money, when the government sets the money, when the government creates the money, then the government has a vested interest in the money and how they spend it. And if they spent their money judiciously, and if they regulated their budgets based on what's actually happening as opposed to what they want to do, then we wouldn't have this problem. The banks would issue credit money based on the amount of money that's in existence. We can have as much or as little money as possible. The amount of money doesn't matter. I've never understood to say this, to back the cynical skeptic. Have you ever read any of the stuff from the Austrians explaining why all this trade deficit stuff doesn't matter, and how all the macro economists are wrong? This has been an argument that's been going on for 40 years, 50 years. We say we can't have an economy based on gold. We could have an economy based on cryptocurrencies, where there's no governments involved, where there's just bitcoins running around, for example, or some basket of cryptocurrencies. You just need money to liquefy trade and for people to issue loans denominated in. Governments don't have to be involved in any of this. Money exists outside of government. Only government exists now, and that's the problem. Right, then private banks have to create new money, and they're going to create it via credit, or they're going to create it by some other means. Exactly, and the price of the money will rise and fall based on the business cycle. But money should be deflationary, not inflationary. But inflation and deflation are two sides of the same coin. You either have to issue more money to liquefy more trade, thereby devaluing each individual monetary unit, or you have to allow money to be infinitely fungible, a dollar to be infinitely fungible, right? And go to fewer decimal places in order to retain the value of a dollar. The problem is, and this is the biggest problem, and this is the part that everybody misses, because no one wants to talk about this, that the issuance of new money because it all flows through the government capital account. Take the government out of the process. Take the government out of the process. Use Bitcoin. No. We want to do this because we've enjoyed the outrageous advantage of being able to use the dollar to create whatever deficit we want. The deficit itself, the $21 trillion that we owe, is just a reflection of the number of dollars that are out there in the marketplace. That I'll agree with. Right? That's the that's the problem of the world's reserve currency. And everybody who issues dollars that way, yes. If you want one currency to run the world, well, then that's what you have to. Then that's what ultimately happens. Otherwise, then yes, you have a buildup of gold or Bitcoin in one place and a deficit in other places, and the value of it rises in one place and it falls in the other place. But guess what? Then gold that's valued on one side of the world more than it's valued on the other side of the world now buys more goods, and then the money flows, and then the gold flows back in the other direction. And it goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. When you have one currency to rule them all, that's been used like a fucking political cudgel to get people to do what we want them to do, which is what we've been doing, then we have a problem. Money can flow back and forth. Trade deficits are not a bad thing, and trade surpluses are not a bad thing. They are a reflection of business. They're a reflection of what, all things being equal, ceteris paribus, all things being equal, they're not indicative of anything other than money flowing out or money flowing back in. But as the value of the money fluctuates, relatively speaking, the value of goods going back and forth will fluctuate. You don't have to have more money. You can have more money. You can have the same amount of money chasing more goods, and thereby no, you don't. No, you don't. See, that's the problem. See, this is what I was talking about at the beginning of the scope. This is going to wrap it all up real quick. Okay, and this is going to be a kind of a high concept thing. That's the problem with thinking in terms of nations, in terms of banks, in terms of nations or organizations or whatever. The larger the organization, the greater the potential for a particular failure. Okay, if the money is independent of the money issuance is independent of humans, then it doesn't. Then all of this becomes a different exercise. But you're talking in terms of a financial crisis. Systemic financial crisis? One bank failure. Bank overissues credit and doesn't do proper risk assessment. That bank fails. One bank fails. Maybe two banks fail. In the down part, as the business cycle goes, as the business cycle is allowed to purge and expand and purge and expand, that's fine. We don't do that. We bail out the banks and print more money and then devalue the currency and destroy everybody's wealth and leave the zombie banks running around. That's what we're doing now. All those people should have been deleveraged. All those people should have been wiped out. Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and the rest of them, they should all have been wiped out. Monetary base should have been reset to the level of the pool of real savings that actually undergirds the real pool of savings that undergirds the economy, as opposed to what we've been doing. Everything is more of a disaster because of the interventions, because of the issuance of debt-based. No. The banks are allowed to create money not for non-productive. There's one way of putting it. It's not non-productive purposes. This is where Steve Keen is all wrong, because Steve Keen is still a mixed monetary theorist. He's not Austrian. You understand is that the government sets the interest rates. They set the risk, and they screw up the structure of production. That's what actually causes the boom and bust cycles to be exacerbated by orders of magnitude more than a free market in money and banking would actually produce. I don't actually advocate for fractional reserve banking. I don't actually advocate for any of that. I advocate, actually, if you want, we don't discuss it here anymore because there's no point. But if you want my honest opinion about what actually should be going on, is we should have 100% reserve banking. 100% reserve banking. Credit money is something that should only be used temporarily to assuage a liquidity issue. That banks issue temporarily in order to deal with temporary shortfalls based on the risk profile of the bank and their book of business and all that other stuff. But that should be between private organizations that take on that risk. It should not be systematized or institutionalized through central banks. and governments that are all corrupt because they all get a cut of the process. They all get a cut because they're the ones that get to issue the money and pay for everything at today's prices for tomorrow's goods. With more money chasing the same number of goods, even though the whole economy doesn't know that there's more money chasing the same number of goods. And they all get the VIG, and that's why we're all going broke. And that's half the problem. Oh, horse shit. Then Werner is wrong. Cynical skeptic, you and I just fundamentally disagree. If you do not understand the interest rate, the cost of money, and the structure of production and risk, and you need to read the Austrian business cycle theory. I'm sorry. You need to sit down and read Mises, Rothbard. I actually absolutely recommend Economics in One. First, Economics in One Lesson by Harry Hazlitt, so you fully, truly understand the broken window fallacy. And then two, that you read something like Economics for Real People, or hell, Murray Rothbard's What Has Government Done to Our Money? That'll work. It's a little outdated, but it works beautifully. Or even better, sit down and read the Theory of Money and Credit by Mises. I think that's where if not, then a simple redux of the Austrian business cycle, so you understand why interest is absolutely the most important part of the entire process. Because interest sets the risk. Interest is not about anything other than setting about getting the risk of a particular investment right. This fact that if you don't think that interest rate matters, no, I need to fucking read Werner because Werner's wrong. You need to read the Austrians, period. If you're not reading the Austrians, then you have no frame of reference, because the mixed monetary theory guys and the Keynesians and Samuelsonites and the Marxists are all wrong. They're all just flavors of Marxist. Sorry. It's why we Austrians have more predictive power than the rest of them, because we understand what actually happens when these people screw up the marketplace. All right, guys, it's way late. I'm way over time. I gotta go. You guys take care. You have a great night. We'll talk soon. I'll be back maybe Wednesday morning. I don't know. We'll see. I got a friend coming into town Wednesday night, so not really sure. We'll see. You guys take care. If not, Friday night. Take care. Keep your stick on the ice.